welcome back to the Ancient Cricks Podcast, Episode 3.
It's podcast time, and in this episode, we will be talking about the slave trade in the Americas.
We have two new speakers today joining us on this topic of slavery.
Hi, I'm Emmett, and you might remember me from episode 2.
And hi, I'm Prin.
And just in case you don't remember, I'm Ada.
And I'm Ezra.
Today we'll be reading a short story about a plantation owner's daughter who was curious, and the story is called Shadows of the Past.
I'm Prin, the narrator.
I'll be Abigail, the plantation owner's daughter.
I'm Elijah, a young enslaved man who is seeking freedom.
But before we get into the story, what do you guys know about slavery?
I think don't they trade people from Africa to Europe, parts of Europe? Yeah.
So yeah, it's like they would take this person as their property basically, and just take away all their rights, and
They were forced to work without consent.
make them forced labor and stuff like that.
But there were different levels of slavery. Yes, there were some where they were forced to work and they were owned, but some parts they were just helping and they were working for these people, but they weren't fully owned and couldn't be traded. So there's different levels.
So there's I'm just going to list a few of the different levels. There's debt bondage, which is where they have to be in slavery for a loan. They have to pay it off. So it kind of they have to pay someone off so they enslave themselves to that person. Chattel slavery, which is the most extreme form that we're going to kind of be discussing today, where they're treated as property and can be bought, sold, traded in markets and stuff.
I think that was the most common form of slavery in that time with the Americas, because they would just be taken from their tribes in West Africa and then shipped across in these terrible ships to the Americas to be used for hard labor and work on cane factories and plantations.
Yeah. And plantation slavery. So they're just work to force labor on farms, basically. And it was common in the Americas, North and South. So that's kind of what we're going to be discussing today.
All right, but let's get into the story. Ada, would you like to start us off?
I think Prin's gonna narrate it. Well, let's actually talk about the setting first. It's in a very dimly lit room on a slave ship, the sound of waves crashing against the hull.
In the 18th century, the transatlantic slave trade tore families apart and altered the lives of countless individuals. This story unfolds abroad a ship bound for the Americas, where hope and despair collide in the hearts of those ensnared by the merciless hands of fate. Elijah stands in the corner, shackled and frightened. He gazes out at the horizon, whispering to himself,
I can't let them break me. Freedom lies somewhere beyond these waves, somewhere I can breathe.
Samuel enters, clipboard in hand, surveying the conditions on the ship. Sighing to himself,
What have I done? Each tally mark represents a life, a dream crushed, but I must keep my business afloat.
Abigail enters, carrying a small basket of food. Brightly,
Father says we're to take good care of the cargo. They're just people after all. Why don't we treat them like humans?
turning to her,
Abigail, you must understand, these are not just people. They are property. The world of trade sees them as assets.
frowning,
But how can you look at them that way? They have families, hopes.
interrupting, his voice strong.
Hopes that are stolen, just like our lives. You think that this is a business? We are not commodities.
Abigail is taken aback, her eyes wide with shock.
I didn't mean.
Elijah, your spirit is admirable, but do you think speaking will change your fate?
Determined,
I may be shackled, but my spirit is free. I will not let fear silence me.
Abigail kneels down, looking into Elijah's eyes.
What if we could help you? What if you could escape this life?
You live in a world of privilege. You don't understand the risks.
Abigail, the more you involve yourself, the more you danger your life.
I don't care. I stand by and do nothing. We must do something, anything.
In a world with fraud and cruelty and injustice, small sparks of hope flicker even in the darkness of places. But the path to freedom is fraught with peril, and choices made in haste can have dire consequences. The scene shifts, showing the ship docking at a port in the Americas.
This is where our this is where our lives diverge. You, Elijah, you'll be sold, and you, Abigail, you must return home. You must stay safe.
I will find a way to escape this fate, even if I must walk through fire.
Promise me you'll fight for your freedom.
And you, remember me. Fight for those who cannot fight for themselves.
Samuel watches conflicted.
This system is corrupt, but I'm bound by it. I cannot change what I am.
Then perhaps you are part of the problem. Your silence speaks louder than your actions.
As the ship doors opens, the weight of choice hangs heavy in the air. Each character stands at a crossroad where their path will lead them into the shadow of history, marked by resilience and hope, or further into the depth of despair. Elijah steps forward, taking a deep breath.
No matter where this leads, I will not give up. The fight for freedom is a fire that will not be extinguished.
The lights dim, leaving a spotlight on Elijah as the sound of the market bustle fill the air. And so, with courage in his heart, Elijah prepares to face a world that seeks to deny his humanity. The battle against oppression is long, but it begins with a single voice that refuses to be silenced.
Before we get into the questions, though, we have a special guest speaker I would like to introduce Mr. Matt.
Thank you, thank you. It's nice to be here. I look forward to asking some questions, answering some questions, and asking some questions of myself. But hello to your millions of fans out there.
Yes, thank you. Okay, so let's talk about the story. What are your guys' thoughts on the story?
So here, I got some questions relating to the story. So, you know how the condition were like on the ships, right? Like, how bad was it?
Elijah must have lived in a terrible condition, and he still had hope. Like they had to lie down in these ships, and just they couldn't get up, they couldn't move. There was like floorboards above them, and they would lie down there, and they would have to just do everything lying down, and they'd have food dropped on them for them to eat.
Yes, it was very dark, crowded, not enough food for everyone. Everyone had to lie down in like rows. There was poop and pee everywhere.
They just had to go where they were at.
I think many people died on those ships. But since it was so easy and cheap to ship them, that just it would continue. It would be a cycle. So as they died, more would just be shipped from Africa, and then they would just have more people in the Americas, and
I
it
think,
didn't seem as like a cost to them.
yeah, I think about like 1.8 million slaves died on the ship. The conditions were so harsh and like there wasn't enough space. I just can't like imagine being in that position. Like Mr. Matt, what are your thoughts on this?
Well, the transatlantic slave trade was probably the worst version of slavery that the world has seen. But slavery wasn't invented with the transatlantic slave trade. Slavery is, people will say, slavery has been around as long as human beings have been on the earth. Um, but this story reveals how the transatlantic slavery was really the bottom of the cesspool when it came to the history of slavery.
Yeah, and I think the forms of slavery before they were less harsh, and sometimes they weren't even oppressing. Sometimes it was just they had to work for them. They had their own lives. They just had to work for the people they had to work for. So, but they could have their own lives, and they would live in their own houses, and they'd just go work. It was more like they were workers, but they were forced to anyways.
Mm-hmm. Good point.
So, something about the ships of the slaves, they actually had special ships made to ship the slaves from Africa to the Americas. So they were just like, they were prioritized in just having lots of flat space on the bottom so they could store as many slaves as they could. just laying down or sitting. And they would cut extra ventilation holes along the side just so that then they could breathe. Not as many would die. But yeah, they also had nets on the sides of the ship. Some of the ships, at least, had nets on the sides. So then, whenever some slaves would try to just end their lives because they would rather do that than stay on these ships and die from some diseases. So they had nets that would catch the slaves if they tried to jump off the edges. It's just crazy.
I think also when they got to the land, it also must have felt weird because they're now being sold as property. They are no longer really feeling human. And so they just have to work and be sold and traded among people.
So I have a question. Can I ask a question, or
Yeah.
I don't want
Of
to
course.
jump the gun? So transatlantic slavery was unique in the sense that it was racially based, and other forms of slavery were not racially based. However, what is interesting is that before you had white slave owners that arrived in Africa for slaves to bring them to America, slavery was already existing on the continent of Africa. And so the question some people have is who was collecting the slaves in Africa that would eventually be put on ships? Anyone have an answer to
I
that?
think rivaling tribes. So like they would be warring, like two tribes would be warring, and then they would catch prisoners of war, and then they would capture those people, and they didn't know what to do with them. So then they just sold it to the white people who wanted workers.
Yeah, it's so what's interesting about it is that it wasn't white Europeans that were walking into the interior of Africa conquering tribes in Africa and finding slaves. They were just arriving on the shores of Africa and then partnering with African tribes that were already involved in the commerce of the slave trade locally. And they were paying for them to go and war on other tribes and collect slaves for them. And then, of course, when those slaves arrived to the United States, that's when it became very racially based. And once you were of a certain color, you had a very hard time being a free man in America.
Yeah.
But what's interesting also is that the word slavery itself, anyone know the history of the word slavery? It comes from what ethnic group?
The Slavic. So it's like actually white people, I think,
Yeah.
right?
So slavery comes from the word Slav, and Slavs were Eastern Europeans, and they were largely imprisoned, or not really imprisoned, enslaved by Muslims starting in the 9th century, and that lasted for over 1,000 years. And so many Slavs from Eastern Europe were captured by these Muslim raids and put into slavery by the millions, so many of them, that the word Slav became synonymous with slavery. If you ever came in contact with a Slav, you just assumed statistically that this was a slave. And that's something that kind of has been lost to history as well, but it's important to know that as well. So I have a question. How would you answer someone saying that the Bible justifies slavery? What would be a possible response that you can think of? Because slavery is in the Bible. It is mentioned in the Bible. Does the Bible justify slavery? Does it endorse slavery? Does it want to perpetuate slavery? What would be an answer?
I don't think so because the people, the Israelites, they were enslaved by the Egyptians and had to work there. But God didn't like that, and He wanted to set them free. So He sent Moses to help them. I think if something is mentioned in the Bible, that doesn't mean it's right. Because like in the Bible, there's many like murders, rapes, and other crimes, and that doesn't make them right if they're in the Bible. They're just telling a greater story.
Yeah. What's also interesting is that slavery in the Old Testament was not indefinite. In other words, it had an ending point. Slaves, you could have a slave, but then the time came that your slave had to be given their freedom. And but that wasn't like that in the transatlantic slave trade. That was generational. You know, you were a slave, your children then were born into slavery. And so again, that's one reason why it was just it was the bottom of the barrel when it came to slavery in so many ways, and it was racially based. But slavery oftentimes in the Old Testament was, this is going to sound really strange when I say this, but not all the time, but in many cases, slavery in the Old Testament was a actual social net. It was a safety net, a social safety net that helped people actually who were in desperate situations. So if you, there were times in Europe where if you owed money to a land baron and you couldn't pay it, you were put into debtor's prison. Anybody know what debtor's prison was?
No.
Debtor's prison was basically you go to this place and you're in a cell and you basically stay there until someone pays off your debts, which hardly ever happened. So you would separate children or fathers from their families because the father fell into debt. Maybe he lost his business. He couldn't pay it back. There was no other option other than you just arrest that person and you put him in debtor's prison and you wait for someone to pay his bill. And that hardly ever happened. So in the Old Testament, um, the idea was that if you owed money to someone, you don't go to debtor's prison. You work it off. You voluntarily become the slave. You would actually go to that person and say, "I will work for you this many years to work off my debt." So you had mentioned before that one form of slavery was sort of uh, like slavery due to debt, and that was quite common. Um, but there were other forms of slavery as well. And then when you get to the New Testament, Paul says something that people will look at and say, you see, the Bible is endorsing slavery. Paul says to slaves, obey your masters. Now, that taken in isolation is pretty disturbing because you can just look at that sentence and say, look, Paul, the Apostle Paul, is telling slaves to obey their masters. See, Paul endorses slavery. But what would you say is the larger context? Anybody have an idea of maybe why Paul would tell slaves to obey their masters in the Roman era? What was happening in the Roman era a lot when it came to slavery? Anyone ever heard of Spartacus? Anyone ever seen Gladiator?
Oh, they would be taken into the winged fights.
Well, yes, but what happens at the end of Gladiator? Like the slaves, what do? They revolt.
Did
They revolt violently.
Yeah.
And so there were, when Paul is writing, slave revolts were common. And if you were a slave and you revolted against the Roman Empire, you usually ended up on a cross. And so Spartacus is probably the greatest and largest slave revolt in the Roman Empire. He was captured. He was a slave. He led a slave revolt, and thousands of the slaves that revolted were all put up on crosses. They lined the left and the right side of the road for miles, for kilometers. And Paul knows this, and Paul doesn't want Christians who are slaves to get involved with violent revolts. And so that's the context in which he says, slaves, obey your masters, because he realizes that slaves should know that Christ sees them as equal, and the day will come that they will experience total liberation, but not to use violence to try to force their freedom, because if they do, they will most likely end up on crosses, and Paul doesn't want to see that. But when Paul does have an opportunity to talk to a Christian slave owner, that's in the book of Philemon, he tells that slave owner to treat his slave as he would treat him, Paul. And of course, Paul's not a slave. So that's Paul's way of telling this Christian slave owner, look, your slave is going to return, but when he returns to you, he ran away, but when he returns to you, treat him as you would treat me, which is basically Paul's way of saying, treat him as an equal brother in the Lord.
I feel like Paul's letters often emphasize like themes of mutual respect and like love, right? Because I think he's trying to urge both the slaves and their masters to treat each other well. Was that what he was trying to say? That
Yeah. Paul realizes that the foundation ethic for the kingdom life, whether someone is slave is free, is to know that in the eyes of Christ, at the foot of the cross, we're all equal. And if we're all equal at the foot of the cross, then that is the basis to have mutual respect for each other. And then Paul also says things like, there is neither slave nor free in the kingdom of God. So that's a phrase that balances out maybe the other phrase that Paul said. Paul says that in the kingdom of God, there is neither slave nor free. So that's another way Paul is saying the moral trajectory, the moral direction that the church is going to be going in is it's going to not allow there to be a line of division between slave and free. And unfortunately, Southern slavery that got merged with Christianity in America ignored those passages, which is quite unfortunate.
That was in Galatians, right? The neither slave
Neither
nor free.
slave nor free. Yes.
Actually,
Galatians
there's like a
3,
few.
maybe.
Yeah, yeah. There's also in Ephesians and Colossians it says it.
Yes.
Slaves, obey your earthly masters. In everything, it is the Lord Christ you are serving.
Hmm.
It's like you're serving your masters, but overall you're serving Christ. Kind of is what
Right.
he's saying.
Yeah, Paul would say other things like, whatever your hand finds, and he would say this to everybody, whatever your hand finds to do, do it with all of your heart as if you are doing it unto the Lord, which basically means one way you can witness is no matter what job you have, do it with excellence, because that can be a witness even to an unsaved slave master. You, as the slave, are free in Christ, and you might be able to model the way of Christ in such a way that your slave master, your master, will see the light and love of Christ demonstrated through your life and enter the kingdom as well.
Hmm. Are you familiar with Paul's letter to Philemon?
Philemon,
Where, yeah,
yes.
Philemon, where he was like advocating for the kind of treatment his like the runaway slave. What is his name?
It's most people would say it's Onesimus or
Onesimus?
Onesimus, yeah.
He was urging Philemon, right? I keep saying his name. How did I say his name?
Philemon.
Philemon?
Philemon is the slave master.
He was like urging Philemon to welcome him home, right?
Yes.
And just take him back as a brother. And I feel like it can be interpreted as like a push toward more humane treatments of slaves
Yes.
and as a challenge to the institution of slavery itself.
Yes. Yeah. Absolutely.
I think one of the big things that was wrong with the transatlantic slave trade was that they weren't being treated as humans. They were treated as possessions. But Jesus died for their sins and died for them so that they could be free. But the Christians took them and enslaved them and said they weren't real humans. So
Right.
that was a fault on their part.
Yeah, I think it's one of the greatest black marks on the history of Christianity in the United States is this period of Southern slavery where it wasn't just having slaves, but the Southern slave owners that were professing Christians were trying to justify their ownership of slavery um, in Old Testament passages, but while ignoring those passages as well. Because in the Old Testament, slavery was not indefinite. In a timeline, there was a period of time where you had to set your slave free, but those would be things that Southern Christian slave owners would completely ignore in their attempt to try to justify their slavery in the Old Testament. So it was a lot of hypocrisy, and it's a black mark on Christianity. It's quite unfortunate, and I think we're still living with the repercussions today.
Why do you think people thought it was okay to enslave others?
I think because money is the god that people worship. And Jesus said when he was on the earth, you cannot have two masters. You cannot worship me, and you cannot also worship money. And the driving motivation for Southern professing Christians to have slaves was economic. They needed slaves, free labor to work their plantations and work their fields to enrich themselves. And so at the end of the day, it was money. Money was the master. And when money became the master, they no longer were able to see um, the teachings of Christ and the ethic of the New Testament based on Christ to be their master and Lord. That became secondary.
Yeah. Also, they had like some like racial theories that the Africans actually were
Inferior.
inferior to the Europeans.
Yep.
And they kind of use that to
Yep.
justify their actions somehow.
Yeah. Yeah.
Which is
What's
crazy.
interesting, though, is that the abolitionist movement, do you guys know what the abolitionist movement was? If someone says the abolitionist movement, that's a big word.
It was the movement in like the Americas, like mostly North America and like the United States, to free the slaves.
Yes.
And let them be free men.
Right. So as much as Christianity, you can say, is partly responsible for Southern slavery, the reality is that it was actually Christians that that brought about the abolitionist movement, which was the end of slavery. So it started in Great Britain because slavery was in the British Empire, and you had Christians that were very faithful to reading their Bible and realizing that all people are created in the image of God, and that is a great foundation ethically to have slavery no longer be amongst us. And so the abolitionist movement was started by Christians that said this is wrong, and these are the reasons why it's wrong, based on the moral direction that the Bible is taking humanity. And then when it came over to the abolitionist movement in the United States, in the Americas, it was led by Christians looking at their Bibles. So yes, you had Southern slave owners looking at their Bibles to try to justify slavery. But on the other side, you had every leader in the abolitionist movement looking at their Bibles and finding the moral trajectory of the Bible is moving away from slavery. And so that's important to note, is that when someone does try to tie Southern slavery to the Bible, you would want to balance that out by saying, yes, but it was the abolitionist movement, which was rooted in Christianity, that brought about the deliverance of slaves.
Yeah. It's like just two different sides.
Right. And only one is right.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's not like two sides of a coin. You still have, a coin with currency. There really was no currency when it came to Southern slavery trying to justify itself in the Bible.
They were like lying to themselves about using, so they would read the words and then they would twist it to go towards what they wanted. Right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I just feel like this episode is one of the more heavier topics that we've talked about. And slavery is just a pretty sensitive topic to many people, but I'm glad we could talk about it today.
So I think for thousands of years, slave wasn't about race until the transatlantic slave trading, and I really like how it connects to the Bible too.
That's it for today's episode. And if you enjoyed watching, please like and subscribe to our Ancient Cricks Podcast YouTube channel.
Thanks.
If you have any questions, you can comment them down below, and we'll try to answer them. And I think that's it.
Okay,
Thanks
you.
for watching.
Thanks for watching.
Bye.